On a winter evening when London glittered with false warmth, the great ballroom of Lady Weatherford's house shone like a jewel cut to wound. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their candles trembling as though they sensed the cruelty beneath the music, and silk gowns brushed the marble floor in whispered competition. It was here, amid laughter polished to a mirror shine, that Miss Eleanor Harcourt stood quietly at the edge of triumph she had not sought, yet could not escape. She was beautiful in a manner society found inconvenient. Not the yielding prettiness of a debutante, but a composed, observant grace sharpened by intelligence. Her posture was flawless, her expression serene, though every murmur that reached her ears carried her father's name like a stain. Once a respected Whig voice in Parliament, Mr. Harcourt had fallen through accusation and ambition not his own, leaving his daughter solvent but suspect, welcomed yet watched, admired yet never embraced. Across the room stood the Duke of Ashcombe, a figure carved from certainty. His title was old, his fortune vast in appearance if not in truth, and his authority unquestioned. He wore his rank as another man might wear armor, polished and impenetrable, and spoke little because nothing required explanation when issued by him. Where Eleanor was measured restraint, Ashcombe was command, and the contrast drew eyes long before fate drew words. Speculation, that favored sport of the season, had already joined their names. A duke in need of influence, a lady possessed of fortune and impeccable conduct. Society assembled the match with the careless confidence of those who never suffer consequence. Eleanor sensed it in the lingering glances, the sudden pauses in conversation, the expectation that hovered like a held breath. She had learned early how to survive such moments, by refusing both hope and fear. The Duke approached her with formal precision, bowing just deeply enough to satisfy propriety. His gaze was assessing, not unkind, but utterly closed. Eleanor curtsied in return, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she offered a greeting. Their exchange was brief, courteous, and edged with something sharper beneath, a recognition neither wished to acknowledge. It was interrupted too soon by an eager observer, and too late by the audience that had gathered without seeming to do so. Someone laughed. Someone whispered. The music faltered, and in that delicate pause, expectation pressed forward, demanding resolution. Ashcombe, perhaps weary of insinuation or determined to extinguish it, allowed his restraint to fracture. His voice carried, measured yet merciless, shaped to be overheard. "Even if you were the last woman alive, madam, I would never marry you." The words fell with ceremonial precision, as final as a sentence passed. Silence rippled outward, followed by the low, dangerous hum of reaction. Eleanor felt the blow as one feels cold water, shocking yet clarifying. She did not flinch. Her chin lifted, her composure intact, and in that moment she chose herself. "Then, Your Grace," she replied evenly, "we are spared a mutual inconvenience." It was enough. Dignity, delivered without plea or protest, unsettled the room more than tears might have done. Yet society is kinder to spectacle than to restraint, and sympathy, such as it was, evaporated quickly. The music resumed. Conversation surged back, richer for the feast of humiliation it had consumed. Eleanor stood alone, suddenly visible in a way no woman wishes to be. Ashcombe turned away, his duty, as he understood it, fulfilled. He had silenced rumor, protected his standing, and drawn a clear boundary between himself and scandal. Yet as he rejoined his peers, an unfamiliar tension lodged beneath his composure, the faint unease of having acted decisively and still feeling wrong. Eleanor remained until propriety permitted her departure. Each courtesy she received thereafter was sharpened by pity or curiosity, and she accepted them all with the same measured grace. When at last she reached the carriage, the night air met her flushed skin, and she exhaled, long and controlled, refusing herself the luxury of collapse. By morning, the incident had transformed into narrative. Words grew in the telling, sharpened by delight. Eleanor's calm reply became pride, then provocation, then proof of dangerous independence. Invitations dwindled. Doors opened with hesitation. She moved through it all with careful resolve, aware that survival in such a world depended not on innocence, but on endurance. In a candlelit bedchamber, she removed her gloves with deliberate slowness, examining her hands as though they belonged to another woman. She understood, with painful clarity, that something irrevocable had occurred. Not merely a rejection, but a declaration of value rendered publicly and denied. The days that followed unfolded with deceptive calm. Eleanor attended to her obligations, answered letters, and received her mother's quiet concern with practiced reassurance, yet beneath the routines her thoughts sharpened. She knew the architecture of society too well to mistake this moment for a passing cruelty. It was a turning, subtle but decisive. She would be required now to prove not charm, but worth, not desirability, but steadiness. Such trials were rarely announced, and never fair. Still, she resolved to meet them with the same restraint that had carried her through the ballroom, believing that time, if nothing else, rewarded those who did not retreat. As for the Duke, he slept uneasily, troubled by a restlessness he dismissed as fatigue, unaware that the words he had flung so cleanly into the air had begun their slow return, circling back through corridors of debt, duty, and consequence, seeking him with a patience as unyielding as winter. Thus, before either understood the depth of the wound or the cost of pride, England's polite machinery had begun its work, arranging meetings, necessities, and inevitabilities, and drawing two unwilling figures toward a future neither had chosen yet imagined. Weeks after the ballroom incident, the Duke of Ashcombe returned to his ancestral estate beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, the land stretching wide and silent as though withholding judgment. The house rose from the frost-bitten ground with all the authority of history, yet within its walls the illusion of permanence had begun to fracture. Ledgers lay open on mahogany desks, their columns whispering of debts carefully concealed, rents unpaid, and obligations postponed beyond prudence. Ashcombe read them alone, his expression unchanged, though each figure carved another shallow line of irritation into his thoughts. The truth he would not speak aloud pressed hardest in silence. His fortune, like his pride, had been sustained by appearances. Generations of confidence had disguised fragility, and now Parliament's murmurs of reform threatened to expose what ceremony had long protected. The privileges of rank were no longer inviolable, and Ashcombe understood, with reluctant clarity, that survival demanded adaptation he had been trained to despise. It was during this reckoning that a letter arrived, sealed discreetly, its language precise to the point of menace. A representative of the Crown, writing with courteous detachment, outlined concerns for stability among the great houses and suggested, without command yet unmistakably, that alliances of sense would soon be expected. One name was mentioned, briefly, as if incidental: Miss Eleanor Harcourt. Ashcombe folded the letter with controlled force. The irony was sharp enough to wound. Of all women, it was the one he had publicly dismissed, the one whose fortune remained unblemished by her father's disgrace, whose reputation had survived even his cruelty. The Crown did not traffic in sentiment. It trafficked in solutions. Eleanor Harcourt, it seemed, was one. Far away, Eleanor received her own summons, delivered through channels both polite and inescapable. An invitation to a country gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances, framed as a gesture of reconciliation, though its purpose was transparent. She read it once, then again, aware that refusal would confirm every unkind suspicion. Acceptance, however, required a fortitude she summoned without illusion. When she arrived at the estate days later, the air was sharp with early spring, the grounds orderly to the point of severity. Ashcombe greeted her with impeccable courtesy, his expression composed, yet something unsettled flickered briefly across his gaze. Their conversation was restrained, their words chosen with surgical care, but beneath the formality ran a current of unwilling recognition. They were no longer strangers, yet neither were they free. Over the following days, proximity performed its quiet work. Shared meals passed without incident, yet observation replaced avoidance. Ashcombe noted Eleanor's discipline, her refusal to draw attention, the way servants responded to her with unforced respect. Eleanor observed his vigilance, the burden of command he carried without complaint, the moments when his composure faltered only to be restored by habit. A riding accident provided the first fracture in their careful distance. Eleanor's horse startled near the tree line, and it was Ashcombe who intervened, steadying both animal and rider with instinctive precision. For a breathless moment, concern displaced pride, and Eleanor met his gaze without defensiveness. Gratitude passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. The incident did not escape notice. Whispers followed, sharpening into rumor, for society required scandal to justify attention. At an evening gathering, a careless remark threatened to entangle Eleanor once more in her father's political shadow. Ashcombe, listening, felt something unfamiliar stir, a resistance not born of strategy but impulse. He corrected the speaker coolly, offering protection without explanation, and the room recalibrated around his authority. Later, Eleanor thanked him with measured sincerity. He dismissed it curtly, yet her composure unsettled him more than reproach might have done. She did not seek favor, nor did she pretend ignorance of her position. In her restraint, he recognized a mirror of his own discipline, sharpened by vulnerability rather than power. As days passed, gifts appeared without acknowledgement, a book placed deliberately where she might find it, a repaired bridle returned without comment. Each gesture was restrained, deniable, yet laden with meaning. Eleanor accepted them without assumption, understanding that restraint was their shared language. Still, danger pressed close. Letters arrived bearing news of renewed scrutiny upon the Harcourt name, the past refusing burial. Eleanor absorbed the threat quietly, preparing herself for retreat if necessary. Ashcombe watched her pack one evening, the sight provoking an unease he did not yet name. When she announced her intention to depart early, citing obligation, he felt the loss with unexpected sharpness. He offered no protest, only formality, yet as her carriage disappeared down the drive, the estate felt diminished. Alone once more, Ashcombe returned to his accounts, but the numbers blurred, overtaken by the realization that solutions extracted without conscience carried a cost. Eleanor, riding away with composed resolve, understood that survival demanded distance, even as something fragile and dangerous had begun to take shape between them. Eleanor's departure did not bring the relief she had anticipated, nor did it grant the Duke of Ashcombe the clarity he demanded of himself. Days unfolded beneath a strained civility, each hour thick with unsaid things. The estate continued its rhythms, fires lit, meals served, letters dispatched, yet an absence pressed upon the rooms, altering their proportions. Ashcombe found himself lingering where Eleanor had stood, attuned to echoes he would have once dismissed as indulgence. Her return came without announcement, prompted not by sentiment but necessity. Rumor had ripened into accusation, and whispers of renewed inquiry into her father's affairs had gained unfortunate traction. Eleanor arrived at dusk, rain threading silver lines through the failing light, her composure intact but sharpened by resolve. Ashcombe met her in the library, firelight carving shadows along the shelves, and in that private space formality loosened its grip. She spoke first, her voice steady, laying out the facts without appeal. Her presence at the estate, she explained, risked entanglement for them both. The Duke listened, hands clasped behind his back, aware that for once authority offered no refuge. He had believed distance a solution. Instead, it had clarified what restraint could no longer obscure. When he replied, it was not as a duke issuing judgment, but as a man confronting the limits of his own pride. He acknowledged the cruelty of his past words without excuse, confessing that fear, not disdain, had shaped them. Fear of contamination, of weakness exposed, of loving someone society could wound to punish him. The admission tasted unfamiliar, yet necessary. Eleanor received the confession with quiet gravity. She did not absolve him, nor did she condemn. She spoke instead of survival, of learning early how dignity could be both shield and burden. Her strength, she made clear, had been forged not by protection, but by its absence. The truth of it settled between them, heavy yet clarifying. Silence followed, intimate and unguarded. Ashcombe crossed the room and placed a small object upon the table between them, a ribbon bearing his family's crest, once his mother's, carried always as talisman rather than ornament. It was not a promise, but a gesture of allegiance, offered without ceremony. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before accepting, understanding the language of restraint well enough to recognize its significance. Their accord remained private, yet its effects were immediate. Ashcombe's defenses shifted subtly, his protection of Eleanor no longer reactive but deliberate. When Parliament's debates intensified and her name surfaced in unkind speculation, his response was measured yet firm, leveraging influence without spectacle. Eleanor, in turn, refused refuge that would diminish her autonomy, insisting upon standing beside him rather than behind. Despite this fragile equilibrium, tension mounted. Eleanor overheard fragments of conversation suggesting Ashcombe's willingness to sacrifice the alliance should political necessity demand it. The possibility wounded her less than the uncertainty, and she resolved to remove herself before becoming a liability disguised as affection. Before dawn, she packed quietly, leaving only a note of thanks devoid of sentiment. Ashcombe discovered her absence with a shock that stripped pretense. He read the note twice, then crushed it, recognizing too late the cost of his caution. Pride, he saw now, had merely delayed the reckoning. As he prepared to follow, the estate stirred, and beyond its walls society gathered once more, poised to witness either retreat or defiance. Morning broke with unforgiving clarity as Ashcombe rode hard toward London, the road slick beneath his horse's hooves and his thoughts sharpened by urgency. Pride had once guided him like a compass. Now it lay discarded, useless in the face of loss. He understood at last that restraint without courage was merely cowardice in polished form. Eleanor's absence hollowed the estate behind him, transforming duty into echo. By the time the city's spires rose through mist, he had resolved upon a single course. Whatever the cost, whatever the judgment, silence would no longer govern him and claim his own future. Lady Weatherford's ballroom received him again beneath candlelight, unchanged yet altered by memory. Music drifted, laughter shimmered, and society assembled itself for observation. Eleanor stood near the far windows, pale in silver silk, her composure immaculate despite the weight of rumor pressing close. When Ashcombe entered, conversation faltered in instinctive recognition of impending drama. He crossed the room without pause, each step deliberate, aware that every eye followed. Eleanor turned as he approached, surprise flickering only briefly before resolve reclaimed her features, lending her stillness authority. She neither smiled nor retreated, awaiting his words with patience born of endurance alone. He bowed before her, deeper than custom required, and the gesture itself became declaration. Murmurs rippled outward, but he spoke only to Eleanor, his voice low yet resolute. He named his earlier cruelty without ornament, condemning it as fear masquerading as honor, and publicly withdrew every careless syllable spoken that winter night. The ballroom stilled, held captive by reversal. Eleanor listened, breath measured, feeling the ground shift beneath her certainty. When he finished, he offered no plea, only truth, and waited for judgment she alone could grant without audience interference or protection from rank, habit, or expectation any longer now. Eleanor answered with a composure sharpened by pain and clarity. She acknowledged his courage, yet reminded him that repentance did not erase consequence. Trust, she said, was not restored by spectacle but by constancy, tested in silence rather than applause. Her words carried across the room nonetheless, dignified and unyielding. Society leaned closer, sensing verdict. Ashcombe accepted her terms without interruption, signaling assent not with insistence but humility. In that exchange, equality emerged where hierarchy once ruled, unsettling the assembled ranks more deeply than defiance ever could and rewriting the rules they obeyed without permission or apology from anyone present. The evening did not dissolve into celebration, nor did it collapse into scandal. Instead, it transformed, reordering alliances with quiet precision. Ashcombe's title endured, though diminished in influence, its future reshaped by visible choice rather than silent manipulation. Eleanor remained beside him, not sheltered but acknowledged, her presence no longer conditional. They departed together before midnight, refusing further inspection. Outside, the night air cooled flushed faces, and the city seemed briefly indifferent to rank. In the carriage, no vows were spoken, yet understanding settled between them, steady as shared breath marking a beginning neither expected nor planned yet fully claimed. In the weeks that followed, consequences unfolded with measured inevitability. Parliament advanced reform, creditors retreated cautiously, and Ashcombe learned the discipline of concession. Eleanor faced scrutiny without flinching, her dignity proving more resilient than rumor. Together they cultivated a partnership defined by restraint and choice, resisting the temptation to romanticize their struggle. Affection grew not as rescue, but recognition, shaped by respect and tested resolve. Letters were written, estates managed, futures recalibrated. Love, when finally named, arrived without drama, undeniable precisely because it had survived every attempt at erasure by pride, fear, and public judgment imposed upon them both quietly. England remembered the Duke's reversal as scandal softened by romance, yet history rarely records the labor beneath devotion. What endured was subtler, a man who relinquished certainty to gain integrity, and a woman who refused to be redeemed by marriage alone. Eleanor's fortune secured estates, but her presence transformed them. Ashcombe's authority persisted, altered yet grounded, strengthened by accountability. Their union did not silence gossip, it rendered it irrelevant. Within their household, speech was careful, promises deliberate, and affection expressed through constancy rather than display earned through effort, sacrifice, and mutual regard rather than fantasy or domination ever again permitted. Years later, when the ballroom's brilliance dimmed into memory, Eleanor would recall that winter night not for its cruelty, but for its turning. Shame had opened the story, but choice had closed it. Ashcombe, older and quieter, never repeated the vow that once defined him. He understood now that words spoken to preserve power could fracture souls, while those offered in humility could bind them. Their life together remained imperfect, shaped by vigilance and care, yet it endured, proof that dignity, once claimed, need never be surrendered to fear, convenience, or social demand however loudly enforced by others or institutions. Observers later spoke of romance, yet the truer narrative lay in restraint honored and pride dismantled. Eleanor never forgot the wound of public dismissal, but she refused to let it define her worth. Ashcombe carried the memory as warning, a reminder that authority untempered by empathy corrodes its bearer. Together they navigated England's changing order, neither clinging to past privilege nor surrendering hard-won place. Their marriage became neither legend nor cautionary tale, but a lived argument for courage practiced daily, unseen, and without applause sustained by choice rather than fate or romantic illusion imposed upon the world they inhabited together. Thus the vow that once echoed with cruelty faded into irrelevance, undone not by time alone, but by deliberate love. Eleanor and Ashcombe stood not as triumph, but testament, their union shaped by consequence rather than fantasy. Society moved on, as it always does, seeking fresher spectacle, yet something fundamental had shifted. In choosing each other without illusion, they redefined power as responsibility and affection as labor. Their story ended quietly, not with perfection, but with endurance, and that, at last, was enough for two people who refused silence and accepted love's demanding cost without retreat or apology from anyone.